When I had heard about Dino Crisis, I was hoping for Resident Evil, but with dinosaurs. Which makes sense to me. Both games were published by Capcom and directed by the same guy, Shinji Mikami. It sounds awesome, and it's kind of what I got, but the final product is, like, I don't know what they were thinking. It seems like they wanted to redo the Resident Evil formula, but with a whole bunch of different rules. It's a clear example of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And while I applaud the attempt, this game's just weird. I don't get some of these design decisions. The story follows a small group of special operatives, one of which is the main character, Regina. Their mission is to infiltrate a somewhat familiar-looking island and apprehend Dr. Kirk, a mad scientist thought to have died but is now back and running strange experiments. Upon landing on the island, the facility is seemingly abandoned, and it soon becomes clear why. Dinosaurs are running amok. Not realizing the seriousness of the situation until it's too late, simply escaping with their lives would be good enough at this point. But of course, our heroes learn a bunch of nonsense about the island and Dr. Kirk's experiments along the way. The Resident Evil stories were always pretty silly, but they at least got the job done in a reasonable way, and the characters played their roles well enough. In Dino Crisis, the plot is pure trash. I really can't tell if this is supposed to be an action comedy or... I don't know, the tone of this game is so strange.
You're not gonna believe this. He was attacked by some kind of dinosaur.
Now that's a good one. So, who was it? Arnie?
This isn't a joke, you idiot. We were just attacked by a big-ass lizard.
It also tries really hard to pit Gale and Rick against each other, Regina's two squad mates, but it's so forced and doesn't add anything to the game. But even so, all of that is just about bearable up until the closing chapters. Those last few plot twists pull one hell of a science fiction angle, and the entirety of the game's ending is so unsatisfying. I honestly want to recommend this game just so people can see how bad the final boss is for themselves. Presentation is about what you'd expect. The low polygon graphics hold up quite well if you're into that sort of thing, and I'm always a fan of this look. However, a lot of Dino Crisis is very drab and gray. For as dark as games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill were like, they at least knew when and where to use color. I guess Dino Crisis was trying to look more realistic, so to speak, but I don't think it came across too well. Just like the Resident Evil games, Dino Crisis has a similar issue where the audio mixing for cutscenes is really bad, and no subtitles are available.
And what if it's a trap? Would you want one of us to come and rescue you?
Don't bother. I'm willing to take that risk.
Remember our mission. We're not here to babysit.
That's your way of operating, not mine.
Thankfully, there are some audio options, but this shouldn't be something that needs to be fiddled around with. There's also an alternate path system where the game seems to be very slightly altered depending on your choices. It's not too dissimilar to what Resident Evil 3 would do, and it doesn't seem to affect much anyway, although there are 3 different endings, so it's perfectly possible that I'm missing something here. Once again, text dumps in the form of journal entries and whatnot make their return, but they're not as well written this time around. Most of them are just work documents or research reports, and they're all boring. You don't read a whole lot that's like from an opinionated scientist or anything interesting until some of the files towards the very end. And even then, it's still not that great. This aspect is a real shame because the files were a big part of Resident Evil, but they dropped the ball here. While the subpar presentation is one thing, it's the gameplay alterations that really has me scratching my head. On the surface, there's a fair bit here that's still familiar. Fixed cameras, tank controls, limited inventory space, relying on a map to navigate. This should all be standard for those with even a passing familiarity on the Resident Evil franchise. And speaking on the camera, there are quite a few instances where it moves around to be more dynamic. However, the gameplay overall is a lot messier than its spiritual predecessor. This time, the limited inventory is only meant for usable supplies, such as healing items and ammunition. Keys that are used to progress in the game have their own unlimited storage. This is undoubtedly a godsend for those who couldn't stand a tiny key taking the same amount of space as a shotgun. Speaking of which, weapons don't take up inventory space either. An attempt to balance this out was made by severely limiting how much of a single item can be stacked. While the heroes of Resident Evil can carry hundreds of shotgun shells at once, Regina can only carry 10 shells in one space. The whole thing is way out of whack. It's not well balanced at all. By the same token, 2 medical kits which fully heal her can be stacked 2 at a time. The enemies are already very non-threatening, but being able to carry so much in healing items really makes the whole thing a joke. And with that, might as well talk about the dinosaurs themselves, the main attraction of the game. I do think it's really cool how you can use the laser grids to stun enemies, but that novelty wears off very quickly. The big problem here is that there's basically one enemy type throughout the entire game. These baby dinos don't do anything, and the pterodactyls are limited to a very specific area, and again, they hardly do anything. That leaves you with the raptor, a different colored raptor, and totally not a raptor, but still a raptor. The T-Rex is in the game, of course, but he's limited to barely a boss fight, if you want to call it that, and a couple of set pieces. No Stegosaurus, no Triceratops, no Ankylosaurus, no Pachycephalosaurus. They have so many dinosaurs to choose from, and they didn't even bother to try. But what's even worse than that is that the clever enemy placement that made Resident Evil really good is just gone. There's no prioritizing of targets or weapon utilization depending on the situation. Most areas are just straight hallways with very few obstacles other than the raptors themselves. And they're usually not that difficult to run around anyway. This is a far cry from Resident Evil, where a small room full of zombies would quickly make short work of you. And don't get me wrong, it definitely feels cheap when it happens, but overall, in Resident Evil, I can tell that they were trying. Dino Crisis, on the other hand, feels extremely lazy by comparison. The one thing that is noteworthy is that enemies can follow you from room to room. No doubt a precursor to how Resident Evil 3's Nemesis works. However, its functionality is even more limited than Nemesis in my opinion, and even then, it's still not enough to cover the other flaws. Your currently equipped weapon can also be knocked out of your hand, which is pretty cool, but it's extremely rare and basically a non-issue. I swear, it happened to me a grand total of 2 times in the entire game. And one of those times was a scripted sequence. At least the dinosaur roars do sound really good, I'll give it that. Item boxes kind of make a return in this game. Since your inventory is both limited and valuable, you're going to need to drop some stuff off for later use. This time though, all the item boxes are not connected to each other. Instead, they're all color-coded. So only green item boxes connect to other green ones, yellows to yellows, and red to red. This is such a strange way to implement the system, and I think they knew that they messed it up. Since there's no way to know what colored item boxes might be up ahead, the player can easily screw themselves up by storing their items in poorly chosen colors. To help compensate this, each new item box open gives the player a whole bunch of supplies, so they should never really run low. In order to help limit this, item boxes require a certain number of plugs that are hidden throughout the game in order to open them the first time. But you shouldn't have a hard time finding a ton of plugs anyway, they're all over the place. Everything does work out in the end, but it's layers upon layers, and I don't know, I thought the classic item boxes were just fine. And here, they're just complicating things for no reason. They tried really hard to reinvent the wheel, and it makes no sense what they were going for. They probably wanted to throw in a little bit of extra stress and uncertainty, which is good for a horror game, but the way they went about it is just stupid, and it doesn't really matter because I ended up getting flooded in items anyway. The item box system here didn't end up being stressful, it was just annoying. The puzzles this time around are a doozy. They got really carried away with this stuff. A lot of them are gimmicky time wasters, and there's the classic using the right key on the right door, or tracking down a password in a file. But can anyone please explain to me why the files are not saved? Better get a notepad out, or better yet, take a picture of the TV screen with your phone. There's no excuse! Why can't you take the files with you? It's manageable for the first half of the game, but the latter chapters get really out of hand. Nothing is straightforward, there's a ton of backtracking, there are so many different codes, computer terminals, and card keys, and I get it, exploration and puzzle solving is a big part of these games, but I feel like they really needed to tone it down with this one. A few of the puzzles are clever, like this one in particular, but there are so many dedicated puzzles that the pacing gets bogged down really bad. I wish I could get more into it without spoiling the game, but it definitely gives me a newfound appreciation for the direction that the Resident Evil titles took. In those games, it's more about item management and routing an efficient path. And sure, there was some trial and error, arguably maybe too much, but it's a lot better than this. Then there are some oddities that I feel were probably implemented at Capcom's request to attract a larger audience, to make this a sort of beginner survival horror. Aiming your gun is even more automatic now, there's no manually aiming to the floor or up in the sky, and you can also move while you aim, albeit very slowly. It doesn't really matter though, because you'll only ever shoot at raptors anyway, and they're always eye level with you. So it's not like these little quality of life improvements really add that much to the game. The game also gives you an insane amount of resuscitation items, which are basically extra lives. And this is on top of having 5 continues. But to keep adding on to this, you can also save your game an infinite amount of times. That's all fine and good, I mean, I think it's a bit much, but I guess I can see the direction they're going in. However, if we're looking at this like a beginner survival horror, then what the hell is up with the item box system? And not being able to take files with you is not only annoying, it's a huge problem considering how many of them have passwords. The map is also horrible, it's harder to read and less clear than even Resident Evil 1. Now, all this isn't to say that Dino Crisis is entirely worthless. There are some cool ideas here. There's a surprisingly robust item mixing system where supplies can be combined, multiplied, and upgraded. They do a lot more with this than Resident Evil's herb and ammo mixing mechanics, and I found it to be pretty interesting. But man, you probably won't even believe me unless you've played the game for yourself. You can't even split items. If you stack items together, they're stuck that way until you start using them. This is a problem mainly in creating the poison darts, the strongest weapon in the game. It requires 1 resuscitation and 1 anesthetic dart large plus in order to create 1 poison dart. However, if you combine 2 resuscitations and 3 anesthetic dart large pluses, then the game gives you 1 poison dart. It's absolutely insane to me. I don't know if this was an oversight or intentional, or I don't get it. To be fair, the game is so easy, especially once you know what you're doing, that you should never even need a single resuscitation or poison dart. But it's just so strange to me that the game was built like this at all. Why don't I have more options to organize my inventory? I don't know. I swear, I've said I don't get it in this review more than any other. It's so strange. I don't get this game. Dino Crisis feels both over-ambitious and unfocused. It tried so hard to take the Resident Evil formula in a new direction, but it seems to have no idea what made Resident Evil good in the first place. And the craziest part is that this is coming from Shinji Mikami. I was shocked when I saw that name in the credits. He made the first Resident Evil, and he helped produce the sequel. And then he directed this? I don't know what happened during this game's development. I swear, they tried to experiment way too much. If you're a huge Resident Evil fan and you've played them all, and you're looking for something that goes in a very different direction, then Dino Crisis can be pretty interesting to look at. However, for most people, I don't think there's anything worthwhile here at all, even for curiosity's sake. Thanks for watching my review on Dino Crisis.